The history of the Roman Empire. The history of Rome began as a small village. Some books say it comprised 7 hills in the heart of Italy. It then grew into a capital, conquering and controlling a vast region that included all of Italy, southern Europe, the Middle East, and Egypt, becoming the most powerful empire in the world at the dawn of the Common Era. Rome controlled what no nation had ever controlled before. It ruled the entire world for a long time. The Roman Empire stretched from Great Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia, establishing a period of commendable peace. However, Rome was a military state, and it governed its vast territory by maintaining a strong military presence in the many countries it occupied. As an intelligent race, the Romans dedicated much of their intellect to developing military tactics, technology, organization, and law, all for the purpose of maintaining the vast world they had built. But Rome was known not only for its military and organizational genius, but also for its culture. Roman culture was only slightly less significant than that of Greece, which had established its state institutions several centuries before the Roman Republic. Roman culture had many origins in Greece: art, architecture, philosophy, and religion. However, the Romans transformed many of these cultural aspects by adapting them to their own worldview and needs. This transformed culture was then disseminated to the ancient and Renaissance communities of Europe. We know almost nothing about the earliest inhabitants of Rome. The first people were the Cro-Magnons, but by the Neolithic period, they seem to have been replaced by migrants from Africa, Spain, and France. These people were later replaced by waves of migrants during the Bronze Age, which began in the region around 1500 BC. This new community came from lands across the Alps and crossed the Adriatic Sea to the eastern side of the Italian peninsula. They were nomadic pastoralists who possessed advanced means of production. They cast bronze, rode horses, and had chariots. They were skilled warriors and began to settle in the highlands of the Italian peninsula. Today we call them the Italic peoples, consisting of various ethnic groups: the Sabines, the Umbrians, the Latins, and many more. Around 700 to 800 BC, 2 new groups of inhabitants began to invade the Italian peninsula. Unlike previous immigrants, these new settlers brought with them Greek and Etruscan civilizations. The Etruscans. Archaeologists believe that the Etruscans came from the eastern Mediterranean, possibly from Asia Minor. Whatever the case, we will never know for sure where they came from or why they occupied Italy. But we know for certain that when they arrived in Italy, they brought with them civilization and urbanization. They established their society in northeastern Italy, between the Apennine Mountains and the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Etruscan civilization stretched from the Arno River in the north to the Tiber River in the center of the Italian peninsula. The small Latin village that would later become Rome was located on this Tiber River. Thus, the Romans were just villagers during the development of the Etruscan civilization, having close ties with the Etruscans in language, thought, religion, and society. The Etruscan civilization, therefore, had the most important influence on the transition to Roman civilization. The Etruscans lived independently in city-states and formed small federations. Initially, these federations were ruled by the same king, but later by a council established through formal elections. Like the surrounding peoples, the Etruscans were an agricultural people, but they also had a strong army, which they used to dominate their neighbors. These conquered peoples became farmers on Etruscan farms. Thus, the Etruscans had time to devote to developing trade and industry. By the 7th and 6th centuries BC, the Etruscans had conquered many parts of Italy, including Rome and lands outside Italy, such as the islands of Corsica. They used an alphabet based on the Greek alphabet. They had a developed school of painting and sculpture, a religion based on theism propagated from the Greeks, and many complex rituals that were later deified and passed on to the Romans. Unlike most contemporary civilizations, gender inequality among the Etruscans seems not to have been much discussed. While the Etruscans were busy building their power in lands outside Italy, and with bustling trade activities with the East and Africa, a city to their south began to grow rapidly. This city emulated the Etruscans in many ways. It was called the Roman Kingdom. The Roman Kingdom. According to archaeologists, Rome was founded around 753 BC by Italic people living south of the Tiber River. The development of Roman society was an imitation of the neighboring Etruscan society to the south. The initial state institution of Rome was a monarchy built on a tribal social foundation. In this primitive society, the man had the power of decision and was the priest of the family. He had the right to sell his children into slavery or even kill them. This despotism was limited after the establishment of the state. Before selling or killing his children, a man had to consult his family and the surrounding community. The power of the king in the Roman monarchy was similar. In other words, the king was like a patriarch bound by a relationship of obligations and rights to the members of the tribe. The king had absolute power, was the lawgiver, the commander of the army, the court, and the high priest. However, the king's power was limited and controlled by a constitution that he was not allowed to change. This constitution was established by the Senate and the Assembly. The Senate was a council of elders, the leaders of different clans, a form of clan alliance. The Senate had the power to approve and veto the appointment of the king, and to review and judge the constitutionality and adherence to tradition of the king's laws and actions. In this respect, the Roman Senate had a function similar to the Supreme Court of the United States today. The assembly consisted of all male Roman citizens. Citizenship was only for those whose both parents were of Roman origin. The function of the assembly was to grant the king chosen by the Senate absolute power. The assembly was organized into 30 groups based on blood relations. Each group had one vote and cast its vote on the majority consensus of the group. Thus, if someone had an important voice in the government, in the assembly, this influence was greatly reduced by the aforementioned group voting method. The growth of Rome's power and influence concentrated wealth in a small segment of society and divided society into two classes, patricians and plebeians. The patricians controlled most of the property, trade, power, and the military, and only they could hold positions in the Senate or the Assembly. The plebeians constituted the majority of the population. Most were farmers and craftsmen working for the patricians, except for a few who worked on their own small farms. They had no voice in the government. Under the monarchy, Rome significantly expanded its control over the surrounding regions. The monarchy itself was established with the purpose of bringing stability and security. The conquest of surrounding territories did not mean that Rome coveted the land and wealth of these places, but rather seemed to be due to the concern of threats from the surrounding inhabitants. However, Rome's territorial expansion attracted the attention of its powerful Etruscan neighbors to the north. The Roman monarchy fell into the hands of the Etruscans in the mid-6th century BC. The Romans resisted bitterly. Finally, when an Etruscan prince of the Tarquin family who was ruling Rome raped the wife of a nobleman, an event mentioned in the historical records of the historian Livy, but many believe it may be a fictional story, the Roman people rose up and overthrew the power of the Tarquins in 509 BC. The Etruscan civilization began to decline from this point. After regaining independence, by completely abolishing the monarchy instead of re-establishing it, the era of the Roman Republic began, an era that witnessed the great growth of Roman power. The Roman Republic. After Junius Brutus overthrew the Tarquin dynasty in 509 BC, Rome entered the era of the Republic, an institution ruled by the Senate and the Assembly. The history of the Roman Republic is a history of wars. All the historical stories the Romans would use as evidence of Roman virtues and values began from this fierce period, a period of invasions and national defense. Hitherto, the Roman constitution did not officially exist or was written down, but was a series of unwritten values and laws. It was defined on the basis of a past monarchy, so although they did not restore the monarchy, the Romans still reserved great powers for officials. At the highest position were two consuls, elected annually from among the patricians. Just like the kings in the monarchical period, the two consuls made laws, held the courts, the army, and the position of the nation's chief priest. Their attire was similar to the kings of the past, a purple robe and sitting on the traditional throne reserved for the king. However, their power was greatly limited. First, they served for only 1 year, after which they could be re-elected or return to private life. Second, there were two consuls serving together, and one could effectively prevent any decision or action of the other with the power of veto. Third, the consuls continued to serve in the Senate after their term ended, which made them dedicated to cooperating with the Senate. The result of these things was that the consuls were not really proactive and creative, so the Roman government tended to be conservative and cautious. By 325 BC, this position was changed to proconsul, who were consuls serving multiple terms due to the requirements of military campaigns. Below the two consuls were two quaestors, treasurers, and a praetor. The function of the praetor was initially judicial, but later became a military title. The praetors were the key generals of Rome. The position of praetor, like that of consul, had a 1-year term and could also be extended during wartime. In addition, the classification of the population according to wealth and tax level, which was supposed to be the duty of the consul, was the job of two officials, temporarily called censors. Their duty was to register the population and determine the amount of tax to be paid. Therefore, they had many opportunities for theft and corruption. For this reason, this position was only given to former consuls, who were the most moral and honest. The censors had great power. They could dismiss senators from the Senate not only for financial entanglements, but for any reason. In the late stage of the Republic, the censors were among the most powerful politicians in Rome. With power completely concentrated in the hands of the patricians, the Roman Republican institution at its beginning was a form of power transfer from the king to the wealthiest class of Rome. The dominant nature of the law, the financial system, and the foreign policy established by the nobility immediately led to the resentment of the plebeian class. From its beginning in 509 BC until its dissolution at the hands of Caesar in the mid-1st century BC, the political history of the Roman Republic was a mess, and frequent conflicts between the two classes of people vying for political power. In 494 BC, the laborers left Rome and occupied a sacred mountain. Here, they established a new government, an organization in the old tribal form, headed by the tribunes, the leaders of their tribes. They openly vetoed the decisions of Roman officials and the laws of the Senate. This government was elected by all, and its decisions applied to all the poor. In other words, the poor had won for themselves the right to write their own laws. In 450 BC, the class struggle movement produced the Law of the 12 Tables, which formalized Roman law and constitution. The Romans saw this as a victory in the struggle for civil rights. It was a tool that helped them define their position in a legal society. In 445 BC, the plebeians won the right to marry into the patrician class, and by 367 BC, a person from the plebeian class was elected consul. The Licinian section law stipulated that at least one of the two consuls had to be a plebeian, with the fact that after completing his term as consul, this official became a member of the Senate. The patrician hold on the Senate was broken. By 300 BC, the plebeians had the right to participate at all levels of the priesthood, meaning they were equal to the patricians in faith. And finally, the decisive victory in terms of power and influence came in 287 BC, the year that the decisions and laws of the plebeian government were applied to the entire Roman community, including the patricians. Rome achieved these reforms without any civil war or bloodshed. Of course, the class struggle was still not resolved, but it was clear that class civil war had been completely prevented. Thus, the Romans reformed their institutions as a spontaneous need rather than in pursuit of any specific plan. During the same period, and with a similar spontaneous nature, they proceeded to expand their territory. At first, the wars waged by the Republicans were mainly defensive because the overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty had led to many attacks by the Etruscans and their allies on Rome. But not long after, Rome switched to attacking to gain control of the territory of its neighbors in order to eliminate the threat of being attacked. Rome's logic was that controlling the surrounding territories would prevent any attack from the inhabitants of these territories, and at the same time create a safe buffer zone for Rome against attackers from afar. Rome's policy of aggression was therefore continued for the sake of its own security. The final result of this process was the gaining of control over the entire Italian peninsula in 265 BC, and then the whole world. It can be said that the Roman Empire was an accident. It was formed in the process of pursuing a policy called security. Only in the final stage of this process did the Roman Empire become a clear goal: the conquest of Italy. The conquest of Italy began immediately after the Romans expelled the Tarquin dynasty in 509 BC, with the first target being the territory of the Etruscans. Allied with other Latin tribes and with the Greeks, Rome steadily conquered Etruscan territory throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The Etruscans were driven out of the Italian peninsula. The Etruscan civilization came to an end. However, the Roman conquest of Italy was unexpectedly interrupted by the invasion of the Gauls, an ancient European land comprising France, the northern Netherlands, and part of Switzerland, a nomadic and warlike tribe from across the Alps. In 387 BC, the Gauls crossed the Alps, quickly defeated the army, and burned Rome. However, the Gauls had no intention of settling in Italy. They were only interested in Rome's wealth. They plundered Rome, demanded tribute, and after collecting enough, returned to their land in Central Europe. Rome was now exhausted, and many of the peoples they had conquered on the Italian peninsula turned to attack them. However, by 350 BC, Rome had recovered strongly enough to re-establish its position in the aforementioned lands. Although only a member of the League of Latin States, Rome imposed its hegemonic position on all the countries in this league. In 340, the states rose up to demand independence after Rome rejected their demands. However, it took Rome only 2 years to quell this uprising and unify the Latin bloc in 338 BC. In 295 BC, Rome began a war against the rebellion of the Latin Samnites living in the Apennine Mountains, with the participation of the remaining Etruscans, Gauls, and a few other Italian cities. The result of this war was that by 280 BC, Rome had gained control of all of central Italy. They turned their attention to the south of the peninsula, to the Greek cities, and quickly subdued this region as well. Thus, by the mid-3rd century BC, Rome had completely mastered the Italian peninsula. Ancient history shows that holding conquered lands is very difficult. However, Rome seems to have found a solution to this problem with policies that were both liberal and militaristic. First, Rome did not destroy these lands, but gave them certain powers. Some places were approved to become Roman citizens, especially the areas near Rome. Some other areas were accepted to only have to follow certain Roman laws. Some areas were allowed to become autonomous, others were allowed to become allies, but all had to pay taxes and provide soldiers to Rome. In addition, Rome allowed soldiers to settle in the occupied lands as a reward for their service. The soldiers had land that could be profitable, and Rome had a permanent army in the occupied lands. To strengthen these armies, Rome undertook ambitious road-building projects. They built straight roads that crossed mountains, allowing the army to move quickly to areas of rebellion. The combination of granting power and citizenship with ensuring swift and harsh responses to rebels gave birth to a peaceful and sustainable empire on the Italian peninsula. At this point, a new enemy of Rome appeared: Carthage, the empire that had established its position in the southern Mediterranean. The next century would witness the clash of these two powerful nations. The outcome of these clashes, the Punic Wars, would make Rome the most powerful force in the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars. The most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean in the 3rd century BC was Carthage, a nation in North Africa near present-day Tunisia. The Carthaginians were of Phoenician origin, and Carthage was an old Phoenician colony from the 9th century BC. The word Carthage in Phoenician means new city. By the 6th century BC, Phoenicia was conquered by the Assyrians, Semitic tribes living in northern Mesopotamia, and later by the Persians. However, Carthage was not affected and became a completely independent nation. Parallel to Rome's conquest of the Italian peninsula, Carthage also expanded its territory throughout North Africa. When Rome completed its conquest of Italy, Carthage had already controlled the entire North African coast from western Libya to the Strait of Gibraltar, the southern coast of Spain, most of the southern coast of Spain, as well as the islands of Corsica and Sardinia in Europe. Carthage was a formidable power. It controlled most of the trade in the Mediterranean, supplied soldiers, slaves, and goods, and accumulated huge amounts of gold and silver from mines in Spain. These two powerful empires began to clash in the mid-3rd century BC, when Roman power had reached the southernmost part of Italy. In fact, the two sides had had sporadic contact before, but neither side had felt a threat from the other. The Romans had a thorough knowledge of the Carthaginians. They called these people by their original name, the Phoenicians. In Latin, it was written as Poni, which is the origin of the name Punic for the upcoming war. This unfortunate war for Carthage was inevitable. Lying between Carthage and Italy was the large island of Sicily. Carthage controlled the western half of the island, but with control of the southern tip of the Italian peninsula. Rome was only a stone's throw from Sicily. Rome intervened in the revolt of the Messenians against Carthage, and the First Punic War broke out. First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, broke out in 264 BC, mainly taking place on the island of Sicily. Rome besieged many Carthaginian cities in Sicily, and when Carthage sent its navy to relieve the siege, Rome completely destroyed this naval force. For the first time since its founding, the Carthaginian Empire suffered a defeat at sea. The war ended with no real victory for either side. In 241 BC, a treaty was signed between the two sides, with Carthage having to leave Sicily, though not yet lost to Rome, and pay a sum for the war. Soon after, Carthage had to face revolts of its mercenary forces, and Rome benefited from this chaos by capturing the island of Corsica. Rome was very wary of the Carthaginians and wanted to build as large a safe buffer zone as possible between Rome and Carthage. After Sicily and Corsica, Rome continued to want to push the Carthaginians out of Sardinia, the island west of the Italian peninsula. Carthage responded by increasing its power in Europe. First, they sent General Hamilcar and his son-in-law Hasdrubal to Spain to establish a colonial regime and build an army. Here, the father and son established alliances with the countries of the Iberian region, and the Carthaginian army recruited from allied nations quietly grew stronger, and the power and influence of Carthage spread throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Second Punic War, 218 to 202 BC. Very worried about this situation, when Saguntum, a small city in Spain, asked Rome to become an ally, Rome did not refuse. A few years later, Hannibal, a 25-year-old young general, became the commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian army in Spain. At first, Hannibal allowed the Saguntines to use the large ports to avoid conflict with Rome. But Saguntum, with the help of its Roman ally, began to play politics with other Spanish cities. Ignoring direct threats from Rome, Hannibal attacked and seized Saguntum. Rome tried to resolve this matter through diplomatic channels. They demanded that Carthage dismiss Hannibal and bring him to Rome. The Second Punic War broke out in 218 BC when Carthage refused this request. But this time, Rome faced a formidable opponent. In the period after the First War, Carthage had created a powerful army. Hannibal took this army across Europe, and in September 218, he led the Carthaginian army across the Alps, beginning the invasion of Italy. Although tired from the long march, Hannibal immediately crushed the Roman army in northern Italy. This spectacular victory caused many nomadic Gaulish warriors to join Hannibal's army, increasing his total forces to over 50,000. Hannibal's victory over the Romans was ensured by persuading Rome's allies and annexing many cities into Carthage. The Romans understood that they could not defeat Hannibal. In desperation, Rome gave power to the dictator Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius ordered to avoid direct warfare at all costs, only fighting a guerrilla war until the Carthaginian army was weak enough to attack directly. But when Hannibal marched to Cannae in 216 BC, Fabius sent an army of 80,000 to oppose him. This army was immediately completely wiped out by Hannibal. This was the greatest defeat Rome had ever experienced. Rome's southern Italian allies defected to Hannibal's side, and the whole of Sicily became an ally of Carthage. In addition, King Philip V of Macedon, who controlled most of the Greek territory, also sided with Hannibal and began a war against Rome in 215 BC. The situation was almost hopeless for Rome. Fabius no longer had the courage to confront Hannibal. Hannibal led his army around Italy without any resistance. However, Hannibal did not have enough forces and equipment to besiege or launch a massive attack on cities like Rome. All he could do was go around the Italian countryside and destroy it. Rome decided to attack Hannibal's rear. Knowing that Hannibal depended on the supply of manpower and resources from Spain, Rome gave Publius Cornelius Scipio, 237 to 183 BC, a strategic genius, the governorship of Spain, an unconstitutional act because this young general had never been a consul. Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus for his victory over the Carthaginians on African soil, quickly conquered all of Spain. At this point, Hannibal was stranded in Italy. Scipio then led his troops into Africa and forced the Carthaginians to offer Rome a peace treaty. Part of this treaty was that Hannibal had to leave the Italian peninsula. Hannibal was one of the greatest generals in world history. Throughout his war with Rome, he never lost a single battle. Yet he was forced to retreat. And although he won all the battles, Hannibal lost this war. When Hannibal returned, the Carthaginians regained their morale and once again rose up against Rome. In 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio fought at Zama in North Africa, and here Hannibal tasted his first defeat. Carthage was reduced to an independent state. Rome now controlled the entire western Mediterranean, including North Africa. This war brought Rome historical experiences. They had faced obvious defeats against a powerful opponent and had finally defeated these superior enemies. The Roman character, perceived from this desperate war, permeated the rest of the empire's history. The Second Punic War transformed Rome from a regional power into a worldwide empire. With Philip V of Macedon joining forces with Hannibal to wage war against Rome, Rome turned its war to the east, first invading Macedon and then the other Greek kingdoms. The final result of the Second Punic War was the world domination of Rome. Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC. In the following years, Rome continued to conquer the Greek states to the east. In the west, they brutally suppressed the Iberians and vented their wrath on the Carthaginians. Historians have recorded the words of a leading Roman figure, Cato, that at the end of a speech on any issue, he would say, "I think Carthage must be destroyed." In the first half of the 2nd century BC, although it did not regain much power, Carthage, through its commercial activities, had restored much of its former prosperity. Rome became increasingly suspicious of Carthage's revival and demanded that the Carthaginians abandon their city and move deep into the North African continent. Carthage, a trading nation dependent on maritime trade, refused this request. The Roman Senate declared war. After a period of siege, the Romans captured the city, and Roman soldiers went from house to house massacring the Carthaginian population. This was probably the most systematic and bloody execution before World War II. The surviving Carthaginians were sold into slavery. The seaport and the city were destroyed. The conquest of Greece. While Rome was busy with internal political disputes and the conquest of Italy, the Macedonian Greeks, located between Yugoslavia and Greece, had conquered most of the Greek territory and then extended their imperial hand throughout the world. In 324 BC, when Rome had not yet conquered all of Italy and was still bogged down in the conflict between the patricians and the poor, the entire world east of Rome belonged to a single man, Alexander the Great, who can be considered the greatest military commander in ancient history. After conquering all of Persia, Alexander suddenly died, leaving the vast empire he had built to be torn apart by his generals. In 312 BC, Seleucus, one of these generals, proclaimed himself king in Babylon and the vast land east of Greece, then continued to expand his territory to eastern Anatolia, Turkey, and northern Syria, establishing the Seleucid Empire, the Second Greek Empire. But Rome seemed not to be very interested in these shocking events. Dominated by internal problems, Rome paid little attention to the external situation and did not yet perceive the Greek Empire as a threat. But the Second Punic War changed everything. Rome was almost destroyed by the Carthaginians, and the Macedonian kingdom, under the reign of Philip V, 221 to 179 BC, allied with Carthage. The Greek world appeared in the eyes of the Romans as the greatest external threat. Philip V was an ambitious king who wanted to expand his territory and turn Macedonia into an empire. Unfortunately for him, Antiochus III, 223 to 187 BC, the king of the Seleucid Empire, had the same ambition. Antiochus III began to seize the territory of Palestine, vying for control of the Ptolemies of Egypt. At the same time, Philip V also began to reach for the Aegean Sea, located between the Greek peninsula and Asia Minor in Turkey and Asia Minor. These two kings saw the best solution as joining forces to conquer Egypt together and then thinking about dividing the spoils. Rome, after its bitter experience with Carthage, had become very wary of foreign countries with imperial ambitions. They had fought against Philip V during the Second Punic War. This war was called the First Macedonian War, and later demanded that he stop invading Greek lands. Philip V refused, and Rome sent General Flamininus to attack Macedon in 200 BC, starting the Second Macedonian War. After 3 years, Flamininus defeated Philip V in the Battle of Thessaly, a region in central Greece, north of the Macedonian border, and in 196 BC declared the Greek cities independent. But Rome was still very wary of Antiochus III. This king brought his army to Greek soil to attack the Romans, but was quickly driven out of Greece and was defeated disastrously in the Battle of Magnesia in Asia Minor in 189 BC. In this war, the Romans did not seize land, but only forced Antiochus to pay a large fine. In general, Rome regarded the Greek cities as free cities with little potential, and Rome saw itself as the protector of Greece, and in this way prevented the development of any centralized power capable of threatening Rome. In 179 BC, Philip V died, and his successor Perseus stirred up the democratic movement and revolutionary spirit in Greece, and Rome invaded Greece again. The Third Macedonian War broke out, 172 to 168 BC. Unlike the previous time, when this war ended, although Rome still did not seize land, it imposed very strict hegemonic laws on its allies as well as its dependent cities to prevent any revolutionary flames. Rome had learned from controlling the cities in Italy that it could extend the subjugation of these cities if it could maintain decisive, swift, and brutal suppression. At this point, the Roman Empire had taken shape. Rome responded to threats as soon as they were about to happen. The defeat of Perseus was accompanied by the heavy plunder of the conquered cities. In addition, the fines that the vanquished had to bear flooded the Roman treasury. At the same time, in the West, Roman officials imposed heavy taxes on the ruled. By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome had become a huge money-making machine with unbelievably profitable affairs. However, this huge amount of wealth rekindled the pre-existing class conflict, and the Republic would have to live in crisis for more than 100 years to come, a crisis that, at the moment it ended, would topple the Republic and push Rome towards dictatorship. The crisis of the Republic. The Roman plebeians consisted of farmers, craftsmen, and other manual laborers. A portion of the farmers worked on their own small farms. The rest, along with craftsmen and other types of laborers, were hired by the patricians for a decent wage. The Second Punic War radically changed the ownership of property in society. Hannibal had leveled the countryside as he campaigned around Rome. All the nation's wealth was concentrated behind the walls of Rome for protection. Outside, the houses and fields of tens of thousands of farmers were destroyed. After the war, the patricians became even richer from the spoils of war, buying up all the arable land. By the mid-2nd century BC, Roman agriculture was completely dominated by vast plantations owned by unbelievably wealthy landowners. The bankrupt farmers flooded into the cities to find work. This was only the tip of the iceberg of conflict. Meanwhile, the Punic and Macedonian wars provided Rome with a great number of slaves. Previously, Rome had slave labor, but it was not until the mid-2nd century BC that the transition from a wage labor economy to a slave labor economy really took place. By the end of the 2nd century BC, the majority of the Roman population belonged to the slave class. This situation reduced employment opportunities and good income for native Roman laborers. If they wanted a job, they were forced to accept an income even lower than that of slaves, a level that was already insufficient to live on. This situation created a huge wave of migration of laborers from city to city in Rome with increasing resentment. The powder keg of crisis had been lit. The Gracchi civil strife. In 133 BC, a dispute plunged Rome into civil war. Tiberius Gracchus, the tribune representing the people, proposed to limit land ownership to 640 acres, thus taking away most of the land of the patricians. Those with more than 640 acres of land had to return the excess for the state to distribute to the poor. Of course, the Roman elite and Senate tried every possible way to oppose this bill. They got a hold of the second tribune, Octavius, and persuaded him to veto Gracchus's land reform. Annoyed by the opposition, Gracchus dismissed Octavius, a clear unconstitutional act. When his term ended, Gracchus committed a second unconstitutional act by running for the next term. Riots broke out during this election, and Gracchus was assassinated by a group of senators, the first time in its history that Romans killed each other. Many have underestimated the role of Tiberius Gracchus in Roman history. Although his reform failed, Gracchus created a new political style, serving the majority. Before Gracchus, political changes were made mainly at the request of and to serve a minority of patricians. However, Tiberius sought changes for the benefit of the majority of the population and completely disregarded the patricians. That created a new class of politicians in Rome, those who were called demagogues for their attempts to gain power by attracting popular support. In opposition to this type of politician, the patricians continued to strive to maintain the traditional political structure, serving the wealthy class. Tiberius died, but the Gracchi family did not stop there. For 2 consecutive years, 123 and 122 BC, Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius's younger brother, was elected tribune. With huge popular support, Gaius sought to pass many laws in the assembly. First, he enacted a law to stabilize grain prices by building warehouses to store surplus grain from the previous season. The second bill that would bring him much opposition was to grant citizenship to all Italians, to increase Gaius's own power. In 121 BC, the Senate passed a decree requiring the consuls to protect the Republic and declared Gaius Gracchus an enemy of the state. Gaius was hunted down and committed suicide. Thousands of his supporters were killed and hanged. Marius. Shortly thereafter, in 111 BC, Rome began a war with Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, a North African country south of Carthage. This war, called the Jugurthine War, was conducted indecisively, and the Roman people's suspicion of the Senate increased. Therefore, in 107 BC, Gaius Marius, 157 to 86 BC, was elected consul and sent to Numidia. Marius quickly defeated Jugurtha, but the person who really completely defeated Jugurtha was Sulla, 138 to 78 BC, an officer of Marius. Although from an old patrician family, Sulla was a poor general. Marius, on the other hand, was a novus homo, new man, the first in his family to achieve a high position in society. Neither was recognized by the Roman patricians. Sulla believed that Marius had gained credit for victories that did not belong to him. The rivalry between these two men was the cause of the civil war in 88 BC. Marius was an innovative reformer. He completely changed the structure of his army by using almost only volunteers. They were the poorest people in Rome, who still harbored hatred for the regime, especially after the Gracchi brothers were killed. Marius promised to share the spoils of war and land in exchange for the long-term service of this army. And something new emerged. Poverty pushed a large number of poor people into becoming soldiers, and these soldiers had deep loyalty and gratitude not to the state, but to their patron general. This personal devotion gave Marius and other future generals a power they had never had before. Sulla. In the 80s BC, Rome had to deal with a series of wars with its Italian allies, who suffered great injustice. Sulla proved to be a good general throughout these wars and was elected consul in 88 BC. Unlike Marius, Sulla considered himself to belong to the patrician class. He defeated Marius in the civil war. The Senate, fearing popular opposition, gave Sulla dictatorial power. At this point, the position of dictator was a constitutional position. The Roman government was allowed to grant full monarchical power to an individual during a time of crisis. This monarch would not have to share power with another person as under the consulship. Sulla immediately implemented government reform within 3 years by restoring the power of the Senate and cutting off the power of the assembly. Although the intention was to restore the original form of government, Sulla used a completely different method. He used the army to kill all his opponents, and even those who were not opponents. The foundations of the empire had dangerous cracks. The beginning of the end. Sulla's reform brought fierce resistance. After Sulla's death, the Senate faced armed rebellions. In 70 BC, two ambitious politicians, Crassus and Pompey, became consuls and immediately abolished Sulla's constitution. A new political trend emerged. Crassus and Pompey allied with the tribunes and the assembly against the Senate and the patricians. In 67 BC, Pompey was given command of the entire Mediterranean for 3 years, and this power was extended for many more years so that he could continue the war in Asia Minor. By the end of this period, Pompey had become the most famous leader in Rome. This made Crassus afraid because he did not have as important a position as Pompey in either the Senate or the assembly. And Crassus decided to ally with other famous politicians, the most prominent of whom was Gaius Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. Caesar came from an old patrician family and was a genius general commanding the Roman army in Spain and Gaul. When Caesar returned from Spain, he requested a triumphal procession around Rome. The Senate refused this procession for fear of his influence on the crowd. Caesar persuaded Pompey and Crassus to reconcile, and the first triumvirate was established, consisting of these 3 politicians. This government ended the power of the government and began the end of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar. The first triumvirate, consisting of Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, began to hold power in 59 BC after Caesar was elected consul. The new government's reform program was promulgated, and Caesar became the governor of 2 provinces, Gaul, northern Italy, and Illyricum, the Adriatic coast of Yugoslavia. Military conquest campaigns were the path to power in Rome, thereby giving generals a loyal army, wealth, support, and prestige in Rome. The governorship of these 2 provinces allowed Caesar to realize his dream of conquest. At this time, the Romans had no reason to invade Central and Northern Europe. The Germanic and Celtic tribes, ancient peoples living mainly in Central and Western Europe, whose descendants are the Irish, Welsh, Scottish Highlanders, and the northern coast of France today. Living in this area were semi-nomadic tribes. The province of Illyricum was a safe enough buffer for Rome against any threat from these tribes. But Caesar still carried out miraculous conquests towards this land. With a series of brilliant military campaigns, Caesar extended the borders of the Roman Empire far to the north of France, Belgium, and even southern Britain, completely subjugating the Celts living there. When Caesar completed his conquest, his triumvirate government disintegrated. Crassus died in the war against the Parthians, ancient Persians, in the Middle East. Pompey turned against Caesar and drew the Senate to oppose him. The Senate declared Caesar an enemy of the empire and ordered him to hand over his command and the land he was ruling. Caesar did not obey this order. With a completely loyal army, in 49 BC, Caesar led his army across the Rubicon River into Italy. Civil war broke out. This was a war between two great generals, Pompey and Caesar. From January 49 BC to the Battle of Pharsalus, August 9, 48 BC, on Greek soil, the war divided the Roman Empire with battles in Italy, Spain, Africa, Gaul, and finally Greece. Just a week before the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's army suffered a serious defeat in a prolonged siege campaign against Pompey's army at the town of Dyrrhachium on the northern coast of Greece. After breaking through the siege, Pompey could have destroyed a large part of Caesar's elite army if he had pursued relentlessly, as Caesar contemptuously remarked after the battle. The enemy could have won today if they had a commander who knew how to win. Suetonius. Without significant hindrance, Caesar retreated to Thessaly, where his army, tired from lack of logistics after months of besieging the opponent, found plenty of food for men and grass for horses. Here, Caesar reunited with his special units under the command of General Domitius Calvinus. Meanwhile, Pompey joined his army with a new army commanded by General Metellus Scipio and followed Caesar southwest into the interior of Greece to a field outside a small market town called Pharsalus, the crossroads of the east-west trade route. Caesar had about 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry deployed on the field on the north bank of the Enopeus River. Pompey faced him with 45,000 troops in a higher position on the field. Caesar's army consisted mainly of soldiers who had fought with him for 10 years in Gaul, while Pompey's soldiers, though more than twice as numerous, were only slaves and poorly trained troops provided by allied kings. Many historians have noted that Pompey's army entered the battle with very high morale because they had defeated Caesar's legendary army a week earlier, and Pompey seemed to have victory in his grasp. Caesar deployed his army for several days on the 4-mile-wide piece of land separating the two opponents to lure Pompey into battle. However, Pompey had become cautious after his time fighting Caesar. He wanted to wear down the enemy's strength by waiting, aiming to exploit the supply problems and dissatisfaction of Caesar's soldiers over time, while Pompey himself was guaranteed a continuous supply of both food and men from the east. Pompey thought there was no benefit in starting a battle, but Pompey was not alone. Around him were too many powerful senators. Some were inexperienced, some were overexcited by the victory at Dyrrhachium, and others were too tired of the war and wanted to end it immediately. They all urged Pompey to start the battle, constantly drawing Pompey's attention to Caesar, who was eager to fight. Under these pressures, and against his own tactics, Pompey was forced to fight. Caesar was very pleased with this because his supplies were very limited and Pompey should have just waited. Pompey seemed very worried about this battle when he made a very incomprehensible statement to his army. Whichever side wins, today will be the beginning of a terrible and endless period for Rome. Appian. Caesar entered the battle with legions 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 divided into 80 cohorts with a total force of nearly 22,000 infantry, 1,000 heavy cavalry, and a small number of light cavalry. Pompey had 110 cohorts totaling up to 45,000 infantry, including both main and reserve forces, supported by 3,000 archers, 1,200 slingers, and 7,000 cavalry. This army was a collection of Roman legions with allied legions from many different countries, from Gaul and Germany to Turkey and Syria. Pharsalus is one of the historic battles where victory belonged to the general with genius tactical innovations. Caesar won because he could accurately predict what Pompey would do. Pompey's greatest advantage was his cavalry under the command of Titus Labienus, concentrated entirely on the left wing along with the archers and slingers. Caesar immediately guessed Pompey's intention was to crush his 1,000-man cavalry force deployed on his right flank. Caesar withdrew 6 infantry cohorts from the rear and placed them diagonally behind the cavalry on the right wing, armed with long spears. Hidden behind the tall horses, this cavalry force was very difficult for the enemy to observe. After a speech in which Caesar strongly pointed out that the entire battle depended on the courage of this force, he ordered his entire army not to act without his signal. Timing was the key issue when facing an enemy with more than twice the number of troops. The steep bank of the Ep1 River protected Pompey's right wing, where he stationed Spanish and Cilician soldiers, a land in Asia Minor south of Turkey. The Syrian legion was placed in the center. In response, Caesar deployed the 11th and 12th legions on the left wing under the command of General Mark Antony. General Domitius Calvinus commanded the center, and Publius Sulla commanded the 10th Legion, Caesar's most elite legion, on the right wing, with Caesar's command post behind this wing. When Pompey's cavalry and archers attacked Caesar's right wing, the blow almost immediately pierced this exposed wing, and Pompey's cavalry unexpectedly faced the elite infantry legion specially equipped to deal with light cavalry. The ambush force was only then ordered to attack by Caesar. They swarmed forward and, with the cavalry, tightened their formation around Pompey's vanguard. In panic, Pompey's cavalry and archers trampled on each other to flee. Caesar immediately took advantage of the victory to strike directly at the now disorganized left wing of the enemy, while having other legions attack Pompey's army head-on. Attacked simultaneously from the front, while the left wing was completely breached, Pompey's army broke and fled to the rear. When the enemy's left wing was broken, even when part of the enemy was surrounded for annihilation, and the other part had fled without daring to resist, shouting, "We are defeated," as they ran. Caesar continued to give wise orders to ensure victory was not just for this battle, but for the entire campaign. He sent liaison officers across the battlefield to convey the order not to kill the Romans, but only to attack Pompey's allied troops. Caesar's warriors ignored their compatriots and began to slaughter the allied troops, who were no longer able to resist, a terrible massacre. This action by Caesar made the remaining Roman soldiers in Pompey's army not have to worry about their fate after his victory, and they returned to Caesar while Pompey's allied army was completely crushed and fled. After witnessing his disastrous defeat, Pompey returned to his command tent, where laurel wreaths had been prepared to celebrate the victory, and for a moment seemed to lose control. Caesar regrouped his army to make the final move, which he wrote, immediately before noon on the same day, to attack Pompey's camp. Pompey, recovering from his period of imbalance, was disguised by his attendants and fled with confidence to the port of Larissa. Caesar rode upon entering Pompey's tent. One could see stacks of silver plates laid out, wide awnings on the lawns, and many other signs of extravagant confidence and victory in Pompey's camp. And it can be concluded that they had not thought of a result like today. That day, Caesar dined in Pompey's tent, sharing with his soldiers the sumptuous feast prepared by the enemy. The rest of Pompey's army surrendered the next day. Caesar estimated that 15,000 people died, of whom 6,000 were Romans. Many warlike senators, including Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, died in Pompey's army. Caesar rode on a stele after the battle. Despite the victories achieved, today, Gaius Caesar could have been the vanquished if not for the wholehearted support of his soldiers. Historians, while praising Caesar's genius in seeing through Pompey's tactics, still regret for Pompey that he was pushed into battle when his patient tactics could have brought him victory. His military plan was well-founded but lacked decisiveness, resulting in a catastrophic defeat. Before that, He had also been indecisive when he let Caesar escape from the Battle of Dyrrhachium with his army almost intact. In the end, the decisive one won. Although there were many more battles, the collapse of Pompey's army was essentially decided at Pharsalus. Pompey was assassinated not long after by the Egyptians from whom he sought refuge. Caesar won, and his courage, along with that of his army, will forever be praised by historians. Pompey was defeated, and many people, along with the poet Lucan, would grieve that the republican ideal had died on the soil of Pharsalus. Caesar then led his army towards Asia Minor in a conquest so swift that he described it in 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BC and was granted the position of dictator for 10 years by the Senate. His power was absolute throughout the empire, and all his actions were above the law and the Constitution. 2 years later, Caesar was appointed dictator for life and quickly took control of all key government agencies. He reformed the government in many ways, but these reforms were almost worthless because of his imperial power. The Romans, always proud of their republican tradition, were very dissatisfied with this power. On March 15, 44 BC, a group of senators led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus assassinated Caesar as he entered the Senate, as was his habit, without any bodyguards or weapons. So after all he had done, Caesar only ruled Rome for 2 years. His assassins, who carried out the assassination for the sake of the Republic, were completely confident that the Republic could be restored. However, their dream disappeared in a brutal civil war that lasted 13 years. When this war ended, the Roman Republic was completely shattered and never appeared again on the stage of history.